What is the history of the Austrian School of Economics? I'm going to run through a timeline and teach you about where it came from and why. So, um, late 1800s, the Austrian school emerged, unsurprisingly, in Austria, in Vienna. And it was a rebellion against the rigid, math heavy economics of the time. And it focuses instead on human behavior and individual choices. There's a bunch of key thinkers that really built the School of Economics, and I'm going to run through who they are now. It's in my view, it's a real underdog story, and it's interesting because why is it not taught in university? Like everything that was thrown at me as an undergraduate doing a business school degree was Keynesian philosophy, central banks, printing money, controlling interest rates, stimulating demand, improving disposable income. It was this very convenient set of different tools and levers that could be used to create a happy medium of 2% inflation and a well-employed economy. And I gobbled this stuff down. I regurgitated it in a bunch of exams, and I got the grade I needed to then get to the next stage of life, which was working as a broker. But there was this whole area of economics that I never even heard about, right? It's the Austrian School of Economics. So when did it start? There was a guy called Carl Menger. So in 1871, he started philosophizing about these different ways of looking at the world. And he publishes a book called Principles of Economics. And in it, he introduced the idea of subjective value. Now, I'll get into more detail what that means later, but he is considered the father of the Austrian School of Economics. And ultimately, what he wants to do is he wants to shift the focus of economics away from labor and cost to personal preferences driving prices. Now, I've gone and read his book, The Origins of Money. It doesn't take long. It's a really short read. And for me, what hit home so much about it was like people have been thinking about money in a very deep and very accurate way for a long time. Like, what is money? And this concept of the double coincidence of wants. I don't want to jump into too much detail at this point. We'll get onto it later in terms of some of the key driving concepts of what the Austrian school is. So from the 1880s through the 1890s, von Bohm-Bawerk, I've said that name incorrectly, I'm sure, but he was a Austrian finance minister and a disciple of Carl Menger's thoughts. And he builds out on this, and he really looks into the idea of capital, interest, and time preference, these three key areas of economics. And his book was called Capital and Interest. And he showed why saving for the future actually creates wealth. And from the early 1900s to 1910s, 1940s, the Austrian school was driven by a guy called Ludwig von Mises. He escaped from Nazi Europe, and he wrote a book called Human Action in 1949. Now, this is an absolute beast of a book. You know, it's the kind of thing you buy. It's this wide. I haven't yet read it, and it's on the to-read list and has been for a number of years. So I will get around to that, I'm sure. But through that, like, beast of a book, he really emphasizes this idea of purposeful human choices as an improvement or a superior way of looking at the economy over central planning. And he predicts the failure of socialism and explains it very, very well. One of his books that I have read is called Economic Policy. It was published in 1959. It's brilliant. You just read this stuff and he's just absolutely just churning through daily life, but synthesizing it in such an accurate way. You're like, oh my God, this actually makes sense. Having, as I mentioned before, been in economics classes, you're like, what are we even talking about here, right? This doesn't make much sense, but it didn't matter because it's like actually just regurgitating an exam and then it'll be fine. Like how stupid that is. 1930s through to 1970s, there was a guy called Friedrich Hayek who really starts to globalize some of these ideas. He actually won a Nobel Prize in 1974. He wrote a book, most famously called The Road to Serfdom in 1944. And his major warnings were against government overreach. He coined the concept of spontaneous order, which is in relation to how markets self-organize without bosses. Moving through to the 1960s to 1990s, there's a guy called Murray Rothbard, and he modernizes / also, in a sense, radicalizes the Austrian School of Economics. He wrote Man, Economy and State in 1962. He wrote another book called Anatomy of the State in 1974, which I've also read. It's not that long a read. You can, I guess this is part of the interesting thing with research is what crops up, when, why, okay, that's interesting. What was that guy reading? Oh, and then you can go and find their reading list and go and read what they were reading, right? And you down the rabbit hole you go. And I will, of course, put in the show notes the resources that I touch on today, because there's a lot of them, right? And the concept of this episode is really just to very, very lightly touch on the most important people, why it even exists, and the main insights that the Austrian school delivers. So Murray Rothbard, just to finish off with him, he really applies the ideas of the Austrian School of Economics to libertarianism, and he critiques fiat money, very strongly, like explains why fiat's a problem and advocates for pure free markets. Now, to bring it to today, there is an amazing thinker called Hans Hermann Hoppe, and there's also the institute, the Mises Institute, which keeps this tradition alive. There are other players that I'm a fan of myself that have been important to me specifically through the Bitcoin space. So Saifedean Ammous, the author of the Bitcoin Standard, a legendary book in the Bitcoin space, but also read his other books, the Fiat Standard and the Principles of Economics I've heard him talk about before. That was the economics book he wished he'd read. And it's brilliant. And it is absolutely an Austrian School of Economics 101 beginner book. And I would highly recommend that. Shout out to Knut Svanholm, who wrote a book called Praxeology, The Invisible Hand That Feeds You. Knut's great because he really brings into like daily real life. Like this is how it affects him and why it works. Larry Lepard, author of a recent book called The Big Print. He's been studying the Austrian school for a long time. I read a great book, shout out to Nathan Smith, who recommended this for me, The Tao of Capital by Mark Spitznagel. How you can include Austrian school concept into the idea of managing investment funds. Not so obvious, but also brilliant book, Bitcoin is Venice by Alan Farrington. And his co-author, I forget his name right now, Sesha Myers, I think. A lot of what they're talking about in that is the genuine fostering of capital, and that's what the Austrian school iterates on and vocalizes so well. Aussie friend Konza, he's been down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, but before that, he's been down the the Austrian School of Economics even before coming to Bitcoin. So shout out to Konza, and some of his stuff online is classic. I've heard him described as the kind of the Austrian attack dog. You can like go, tag him Konza, red flag, and he'll explain to whatever's going on how they're not thinking correctly about how markets work. Finally, yes, shout out to Robert Breedlove. I've learned so much from Robert in his podcast, and he is someone who's gone and read things like Human Action and is able to then, at least from my perspective, when I listen to some of the things he talks through, he reiterates what he's learned so eloquently, and that's just an excellent way of learning. But long story short, the Austrian School of Economics has had some amazing people carry the baton as a form of thinking through thick and thin over the last 150 years. And you're like, okay, well, this is a whole area of economics that I literally didn't even get told about until it became relevant to me. It's hugely influential in, of course, the Bitcoin space, but just generally tech entrepreneurship and anyone who's really worried about inflation.